Sometimes you're watching a movie and immediately it hits you. This movie feels really familiar. Whether it's the same characters, storyline or title, an immediate sense of deja vu will have you running to Google to clarify your feelings. So in this video I'm going to take a look at 5 Chinese movies that also have Korean versions. They may have originally been Korean films, or also been Korean films that have been remade from other countries. Hi, I'm the Artie Dans and welcome to this video, Chinese remakes of Korean films part 1, and we're going to start off with a big one. Montage is a 2013 Korean thriller that's strangely highly acclaimed, although personally I didn't think too much of the film. It was a little bit too long and far too many plot holes to be fully enjoyable, but I did enjoy the way the movie was presented, cutting between past and present to build up the story. And what is the story about? A child is kidnapped using the same MO as a case that occurred 15 years prior, which also coincides with the impending expiry of the statute of limitations, when the case will then be considered cold. A new detective teams up with the original detective to solve the crime, and the truth about how these two cases are connected is slowly revealed. Again, personally, it's not a film I'd recommend to too many people, but I know this movie has its fans. Well, the good news is that at least the original is better than the Chinese remake from 2019. With a decent cast that includes Wang Tianyan from the 2020 mega hit The 800 and the stunning Song Jia, this remake changes a few key elements of the story to fit into more contemporary Chinese society, as well as to conform with movie regulations. The first big change is the reduction of statute of limitations from 15 years to 10, a reduction in the running time of around 25 minutes, and the addition of the mother now suffering from a terminal illness, which was the filmmaker's way of getting around the requirement of all perpetrators of crimes needing to suffer legal punishment. This also adds some rather unwanted complexity too. Her terminal illness keeps her hospital bound for most of the film, but yet we see flashbacks of her out and about. There is also far more of an action focus to this film as well. Not one to completely avoid, but if I was given the choice, I'd probably take the Korean original over the Chinese remake if I knew these details beforehand. Chinese actor Wang Tianyan is obviously no stranger to remakes. First he was in the previous film The Guilty Ones, and he's also in this film as well. The reason these two movies are so similar is that they were both developed through something called the Korea-China Story Joint Development Project, and they were supposed to be released at the same time, but China jumped the gun and actually got their film out first. So while technically not a remake, most people know of the Korean version and are usually unaware that a Chinese version exists. They're not exactly the same though, but they do share some similarities in that in both films the police officers are tasked with an undercover job to save their careers. After a previously failed mission, they both decide that buying a fast food restaurant opposite the location they are staking out is a good idea, and they both end up finding out that running the restaurant is far more exciting than police work. Since Extreme Job is more well known, I'll start with that first. An excellent cast is assembled, including Ryu Seung-ryong, and I've definitely said that wrong, and my personal favourite Jin Sung-kyu, who ends up taking on the role of the chef. Extreme Job features 5 characters in the main group, and they end up buying a fried chicken restaurant, which personally, I think is far more delicious. Clocking in at just under 2 hours, this is one of my favourite Korean action comedy movies, and while it can be a fraction too violent at times, its excellent cast of characters and entertaining slapstick story will glue you to your seat. And surprisingly, Lobster Cop will do the exact same. There's a little less action in this film, instead going down the more comedy thriller route. And just like The Guilty Ones, it trims a good 20 minutes off the runtime of the Korean version, clocking in at a far more manageable 93 minutes. There are a few more differences though, and the biggest ones being that the restaurant serves lobster and that the group has been cut down to 4 members. Where the Chinese version continues to excel is in 2 very clever casting choices. The first being Liu Hua as the older member of the group and also the chef. He does an excellent job cooking lobsters, and you can tell that by the end of the film, he'd rather be a chef than a police officer. But the real scene stealer is comedian Shen Ten. While the poster indicates he has a larger role in the film, in reality his cameo is limited to a handful of scenes, but what great scenes they are. He plays the exasperated restaurant owner who is about to shut down his failing business until he sees an opportunity to sell it to the police officers. Personally, I think you can't go wrong with either film, and while I prefer fried chicken over lobster in real life, if we're talking about movies, even though I love Extreme Job, my choice is actually Lobster Cop. A shorter, less violent film that also avoids something I really dislike about Korean films, the overacting and the ridiculously overpowered female characters. Luck Key in itself is actually a remake of the 2012 Japanese film Key of Life. But for the sake of this video, we'll only look at the Korean version. And like Montage and The Guilty Ones example, this movie was modified from its original storyline to fit in with Chinese movie regulations. In Luck Key, a struggling actor who just can't find any success visits a sauna one last time before he prepares to commit suicide. He crosses paths with a suave-looking man who is actually an assassin, and when he suffers a concussion by slipping on a bar of soap, he quickly swaps locker keys with him, takes his money, and goes on a joyride with his fancy car. But guilt kicks in, and he visits the assassin in hospital to return everything, only to find that his concussion has turned into amnesia. He then seizes the opportunity to take over his luxurious life, until he discovers how that luxury was amassed. The Chinese film stars megastar Andy Lau and headlined the 2021 Chinese New Year box office period. Initially, the two movies follow the same basic storyline, but eventually they move in different paths towards the end, where the Chinese version has a surprisingly violent ending for a comedy film, and of course ends up with everyone in the film facing some sort of legal punishment for all the crimes committed. Along with some strange pacing, the Chinese movie feels longer even though its runtime is only 7 minutes more. It's still a good film, but unless you really love Andy Lau, you're best off sticking with either the Korean or original Japanese versions. And now onto the genre I personally love the best, horror. And along comes Byeon-kyan's popular Bunshin Saba film. But the only things these movies share are the English title and the director. Roughly translating to witchboard, or as what we would more commonly call it, an Ouija board, the original Korean version is about a schoolgirl and her blind mother who move to a small village from the city. The girl, Yoo-jin, is immediately bullied by other students, but to get her revenge, she uses an Ouija board to call upon a spirit who begins to kill each girl one by one. It's then revealed that her mother has a link to the village, and a rather violent ending ensues. Personally, I really enjoyed this film. It gets a lot of strange hate on the internet, and certainly its user rating is quite average, but for a 2004 horror film it's quite enjoyable, with plenty of expected Korean eye candy. Strangely, the Chinese version is a completely different story. Completely different. In fact, they don't even share one similarity other than the director, because even the title is misleading. The original Chinese title of the film is Bi Xian, which is Pen Fairy or Pen Spirit, but the movie is provided with a more well-known English title of Bunshin Saba. This movie has since inspired dozens of rip-offs and knockoffs in China, but has also spawned 2 excellent sequels. And this version is excellent as well, but for different reasons. An author, suffering from both writer's block and the need to escape the presence of her recently released from jail violent husband, takes refuge in a large house in the middle of the Chinese countryside with her young son. But the house has an evil past, where the spirit of a young girl has befriended her son, resulting in some very strange incidents occurring. You would think that the movie would suffer due to the need to conforming to Chinese film regulations regarding horror films, but director Byeon-kyan has cleverly worked within the guidelines to create a satisfying ending that makes sense and will leave a chill with the viewer. But the films are clearly not related, and even worse is there no Ouija boards or pen fairies in the film, contrary to what the original title says, although you could make a link to the fact that she's an author, but then she never uses a pen. It's not very often that a director gets to revisit one of their older movies with an opportunity to improve it, but that's exactly what Byeon-kyan's done here. Not only has he improved upon his original Korean film from 2000, but this movie is also responsible for 2 very popular and well-used trends in Chinese horror. Of the 3 Bunshin Saba films, this one is the highest earning at the box office, and it's not hard to see why, as the original Korean movie translated perfectly into the Chinese horror regulations. In the original Korean film, a group of 6 friends reunite after 2 years when one of them starts to see visions of a girl whose death they were responsible for. Fearing they've been cursed by the dead girl, they slowly meet a brutal end until it's revealed that one of them is responsible for the murders, trying desperately to cover up an illicit relationship he's having that could jeopardize his marriage and career. The Chinese version follows a script almost identically, with a few exceptions that improve the quality of the story and logic. Scenes are replicated to the shot, and the dialogue is even the same. The biggest change occurs with the introduction of an Ouija board scene, where the friends attempt to contact Bisian the Pen Fairy to find out if they are cursed. It's a nice little nod to the director's 2004 film, but unfortunately, while it's a decent scene that's used to replace the animal cruelty involving the cat in the Korean film, it ultimately goes nowhere. Cue number 1, the first influence this movie had on the Chinese horror industry, with countless movies about Bisian the Pen Fairy made after this and continue to be made to this day. The second biggest change, besides all the smaller things like the swapping of jobs and sports for 2 characters, the garden location replaced with a library, and a videotape swapped out for a file on a USB stick, is the clarity around the affair between 2 of the characters, which then rectifies the motive of the main character to kill all his friends. In the Korean version, it's just a simple throwaway line at the end of the film that he was responsible for killing the group, but the Chinese version goes to a little bit more detail, showing him dressing up as the dead girl and committing the murders. This is the second big influence this film has had on the Chinese horror industry, the overused mask-off or face-off reveal, just like a Scooby-Doo episode, but more serious. Comparing the two, the Chinese film is more superior. The 13-year gap between them has allowed for some script improvements and better effects, but it's come at a cost of being less gory than the original and all the nudity's been removed. There's also a Korean lead actress in the role as well. There are obviously a lot more Chinese remakes of Korean films than the ones we've looked at here. Most of them tend to be romantic comedies, so they're not really fit for this channel. But are there any Chinese remakes of Korean films you've seen that aren't romantic comedies that aren't featured in this video? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching. I will see you next time.